All right.
So this chapter is about our local salt marsh. We're going to talk about the marshes around here and what they're like, and then tomorrow we're going to go out to the marsh and we're going to look around and try and identify some of these plants and such.
It's really lit though.
That you're going to learn about today.
Like it's turned. You don't understand. I'm going to be so hyped.
Oh, okay. Good. So as you can see, this shows the water rising. What a marsh is the area between the low tide and the high tide. And you have a bunch of mud there that's deposited by the water as it slows down and comes behind our island.
My name is
The water slows down and all the mud falls out of it, and it creates this muddy marsh area. And there are different parts to the marsh. There's the Tidal Creek, and then we call this area right here the low marsh. And we call this area up here that doesn't get covered by water much the high marsh. And then finally there's the upland where we have forests and trees and that sort of thing. So we're going to learn about all these different areas here. And every day, twice a day, the tide comes in and floods the marsh. If you're an organism living in that marsh, you have to be able to survive getting flooded by water twice a day.
Oof.
That's not easy to survive for a lot of things, and that's why we don't find that many different types of organisms in the marsh. Because only special ones can survive that twice a day flooding.
Mainly just crustaceans, pretty much.
Crustaceans. There's a lot of.
I'm allergic to everything in the marsh, so I can't go there.
Everything?
Pretty much. Besides grass.
Including the air.
Makes sense.
I'm
allergic to oxygen.
Watch the time-lapse footage.
Where's that at?
Don't know.
Austin's house.
Looks local. It actually does look like my house.
It really does.
Now?
It really looks like the creek next to my house.
It really does.
But what would I know? I'm just a scientist.
Tide coming back.
Wait, did it go down yet?
Yeah, obviously. Where did you take this?
Bro, chill, bro.
Your house.
Want to see it again?
Yeah, can we really play it again?
Here we go.
Ultra low tide.
That low tide really isn't that low.
It's getting pretty low now.
It's getting pretty low.
I'll be up there, no way. Up there, no way.
You don't want no problems, big fella.
Pretty cool, huh? 24 seconds. 6 hours into 24 seconds. All right.
Let's watch this one. Tides. Alright.
This isn't our local marsh, but
It's like Washington.
Is this the mountains?
Or like somewhere up north.
This looks like Oregon.
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 Oregon? Yeah, that's all I say.
Alright, tides coming in. So why don't they have marshes?
Like one spot.
So why don't they have marshes?
Right over the
that's a good question. Well, I don't know their particular
Oh, here it comes.
Oh, is it supposed to come all the way up to the
area
top of
here.
the bridge?
Yeah, well, up in Maine and whatnot, they can get like 12 or 15 foot tides.
And whatnot?
What the heck?
They may have marshes, just not showing any rain.
It's coming all the way up.
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Oh, it's kind of.
Definitely Oregon.
Bruh.
Batch way off bait.
Oh my god.
What's that? 12 halfway up.
It is a serious stretch.
Way up. Back way.
Uh-oh.
Sheesh Louise.
It really is like allergic.
Pretty cool.
It's crazy, bro.
All right. So let's take a look at the different parts of our marshes. Now, marshes are, we say that they're a nursery for ocean organisms, which means that a lot of organisms purposefully lay their eggs in the waters around the marshes or in the marshes. And those hatch and develop into all these little types of plankton that will eventually grow into the adults. But the reason why they do that is because there's so much productivity in the marshes. The marshes have some of the highest amount of photosynthesis on the planet. There's full sunshine, there's plenty of water, so they'll grow, and they'll grow quickly. And the thing about marsh grass is it dies quickly. It turns over its generation. So there's not many things that will eat marsh grass just straight while it's living. But when the marsh grass dies, it decomposes and forms this stuff called detritus. Have you ever heard that word? Also called detritus.
I've heard
There's two ways to pronounce it. Detritus is dead plant and animal material that's decomposing, and a lot of stuff eats it. It can't eat. Most things can't eat the living marsh grasses, but when they're dead, they can be eaten by all these little critters here. And these things will eat detritus and will grow and get bigger and become eventually become adults. And so that's why most animals in the sea like to lay their eggs in the marsh or spawn at least near the marshes, so that the tide brings in the eggs and sperm, and it'll grow into the larvae in the marsh area where there's a lot of detritus, so that things have something to eat. So the death and decomposition of the marsh grasses is really important. If we lost our marshes, we would lose most of the animals in the ocean, including all the big fish and things. So here are the different parts of a salt marsh. You have to memorize all of these. This is good multiple choice question stuff. So let's memorize it now. Okay? The tidal creek is where the ocean water comes into the marsh. It's a low elevation so that the ocean water has a place to enter. And that's also where the ocean water comes out at the end. And they call them these tidal creeks. And some of them are just little, and some of them are big enough you can ride a boat in them. And the banks of those tidal creeks are called the levee marsh. And the levee marsh, every time it gets high tide, gets washed with water. There's a lot of nutrients in the creeks here, and it causes the levee grasses to grow a little bit taller than all the other marsh grasses. So the tallest marsh grasses are on these levees, which are the banks of the tidal creeks. Can you remember levee marsh is next to the tidal creek?
Levee.
Memorize it now, not later.
LTC.
Levee Marsh.
Luckett, are you memorizing now?
Levee Marsh, Tidal Creek.
Now, the water within, as the tide comes up, the water spills over the levee and then floods the low marsh. And the water will flood the low marsh and carry a lot of this detritus around the low marsh. And usually the low marsh doesn't have very deep water covering it. And the sun will heat up that water, and the temperature around the low marsh will get kind of hot. The water will get warm, and it's not like heavily flowing, moving water, so it kind of sits and is stagnant and gets hot. And hot water doesn't hold much oxygen. So this is a low oxygen environment. And it causes the grasses not to grow as tall. You can't get very good growth there in the low marsh. You can still get growth, but not as good as the levee. What's that?
It's because the water's hot?
The hotter water doesn't carry as much oxygen. That's the main reason. You also get the water that spills over. Like I said, it has a lot of detritus in it. And there's a lot of mud there, George. And that blocks the sunlight. So you don't get good sunlight penetration of that muddy water either. Now then, as it becomes high tide, the water enters the high marsh. And it is only present in the high marsh for a couple of hours, maybe even only an hour a day, is the high marsh covered with water. So it's like the water goes in, and then as the tide goes out, it goes back. And what'll happen is the water will sit there, but you barely be covered by water, and the water sits there kind of in a pool and then evaporates. You usually get full evaporation from the high marsh of the water, and so it'll dry up during low tide. And this causes the salt content in the high marsh soil to be extremely high. Jason, you with me here?
No.
The high marsh soil, because all the salt water will spill on it and then evaporate, you're just left with the salt. It gets so salty in the high marsh that very few types of plants can grow. I'll show you a few of them tomorrow. One's called saltwort, and one's called glasswort, and one's called saltgrass. And they all have the same evolutionary adaptations. They can survive extreme salt levels. Some of them are succulents, which means they keep water in their leaves, so it can dilute the salt. And some of them just squirt salt out onto their leaves. So these high marsh plants are usually there's not a whole lot of growth there. And sometimes the salt will be so high that you'll see what's called a mud flat, where it's just mud. Have y'all seen this in the marsh?
There are like cracks in it?
Just a bit, yeah. There'll be cracks from where the water evaporated, and there'll just be mud, and you'll see a bunch of fiddler crabs running around, but there's nothing else there. The reason why there's nothing else there is because it's so salty there. Nothing can grow there. Fiddlers love it. The salt doesn't bother them, and because they have adaptations for dealing with that salt, and they have plenty of room where they can see and they can dig holes and they can live there. So you find a lot of fiddler crabs in the high marsh. Now you get up to the marsh border. Okay, so let's go back to memorizing. Tidal Creek, levee, low marsh, then high marsh, then marsh border. Now the marsh border only gets flooded with salt water in spring tides. At the full moon or at the new moon. Only about twice a month do you get water up into the marsh border area. So the plants that are in this area, and I'll show you some of them, they're adapted to survive just a little bit of salt water. They can kind of, if it every day, if it came up, they'd kill them. But if it only comes up once a month, they can make it through. And there's special types of bushes and plants that are adapted there. So you see a different kind of plant at the marsh border than you see at the high marsh. So we see marsh border here on the edges of all our roads that go through the marsh. Like the causeway. Have you seen like all the bushes and stuff that line the causeway?
Yeah.
They're different than the marsh plants.
I have seen
those
water.
are all marsh border plants.
I have seen water overflow the causeway.
Yeah, and those are at spring tides. The water will come up and flood that area, but only like once a month. And so these organisms in the marsh border can survive that flooding only so long. Then you have your transition communities. This place hardly ever gets flooded with salt water. The only time it gets flooded with salt water is in storms, like hurricane-type storms. So you're talking like once a year or less do you get salt water in the transition communities. And so you get a whole other group of plants that can survive once a year salt flooding, or less than that. And also, the transition communities receive what's called salt spray. When the water evaporates into the air, if you're getting wind blowing, the salt that's in the little water droplets that are evaporating, the salt would usually fall back down, molecule by molecule, fall back down into the marsh. But if the wind's really blowing, it can blow the salt over into the transition communities. So they have to be able to survive some salt on their leaves and such. Palm trees and that sort of thing. There's a bunch of different types of bushes and trees that make up the transition communities. They can survive being salt blown on them. Finally, you reach what's called the Maritime Climax forest. This is a forest of trees that are usually oak, like live oaks, and pines, some pines, and sweet gum trees, and water oaks, several different types of oak trees that make up your climax forest. And those really cannot survive salt very well.
Why are they considered in the marsh then?
Well, that's actually considered out of the marsh. So the marsh stops right here at the transition, after the transition. So this is out of the marsh now. We're into the forest. These actually, the trees that we have around here can grow in somewhat salty soil. Not salty soil, but all of our soil on the island does have some salt in it that's been blown here. And we do have some species here that have a greater salt tolerance than species you'd find inland. So, Tidal Creek, levee, low marsh, high marsh, Marsh Border, transition community, Maritime, Climax.
I got it in my head already.
You got it all memorized?
Yep.
I know it.
I know it.
All right, let's look through some of the pictures. So let's start with the levees. So here's a tidal creek running through here, and these are the levees on the sides. The levee is the side of the tidal creek. And this is looking from a boat at one of the levees.
Lobo.
And that's where you get the tallest grass growth is there on the sides. You can see that here we have a bunch of mud, one of these mud flats. That's the place I'm talking about that has mostly high levels of salt due to the water getting on it and then evaporating quickly.
So that's the high marsh?
High levels, yeah, that's in the upper marsh, yeah. Oh, let me talk about this grass. You need to know what marsh grass is. It's all one type of grass.
You say the Spartina?
Spartina, that's right. It's called, let me erase this. You need to know this. So Spartina is the genus, and there's about 18 or 20 different Spartina grasses. But the kind we have around here is called alterniflorens. Alterniflorens. I think that's it. I may have misspelled it. Spartina alterniflorens. And that, it's a Latin name, but the common term for it is cordgrass. Smooth cordgrass is what we call this. It's all the same species. When you look out over a marsh, all the green grass that you see is all a single species that somehow adapted to be able to live getting flooded twice a day and having all this salt and having this mud that has very little oxygen in it. And it evolved all these different things. It can take salt and it can excrete it out through its little stomates, its little holes in the leaves. It can excrete salt, and it can it has little tubes to get oxygen to the roots. And when it evolved those things, it could grow in the marsh, and nothing else can. So anywhere where there's marsh, it grows, and it grows unchallenged. And that's why our marsh looks, part of its beauty is that it's the same type of grass all the way through, and it just looks like a field of, if you wouldn't know any better, you'd think they were growing crops there, but it's not, it's all marsh grass. My buddy Denzel said he drives buses for Sea Island, and he said that he was driving a lady over, and she was looking at the marsh while she was coming over the bridge, and she said, "Oh my gosh, look at that, that's beautiful. Who mows all that grass?"
Oh my God.
And Denzel said, "Sea Island takes care of that." It only grows to a certain height. She didn't know, she's from out of town. But all that Spartina. Okay, so let's look at some of the types of plants that we're going to see tomorrow, and I'm going expect you to know some of these plant types for the test, and I'll show them to you tomorrow, and you'll have to draw some of them and put them in your log books. But this is glasswort. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah.
That is a succulent.
I know it is,
Sea pickle?
yeah, there you go.
Sea pickles. That's another name for it.
Can't you eat them?
You can. So this is a succulent. Succulent means the leaves are thick, and in this case the stems are thick and filled with water.
So what do you do? Bite it or just eat it?
And you can, you can pick that and you can take a bite of it. It'll taste real salty because the water has salt in
It
it.
does taste pretty good.
But
Just like salt water.
it dilutes the salt enough so that it can survive with water that it keeps in its leaves. And here's another one called saltwort. This also has thick leaves.
I've seen those before.
Seen those? Thick, succulent leaves. That's another science word you should know. Succulent means it has thick leaves that retain water and help dilute the amount of salt that's inside the leaves. And so they have these thick leaves, and yeah, if you take a bite of that stuff, it'll taste real salty. We can do that tomorrow if you want to. And then there's this saltgrass.
Yeah, we will.
And do you see, it looks like, some people call it fishbone grass, because it looks like fish bones, the way the leaves come off of the stem.
I can see it.
But you can see all the salt crystals? What this saltgrass does is it takes salt that's inside the plant and it excretes it out onto the blades and is able to survive and not be so salty on the inside because it squirts out the salt. Cordgrass does the same thing. Smooth cordgrass, the Spartina, it'll squirt salt out onto its leaves. So that's some of the plants we see in the high marsh. Some of the animals you'll see in the high marsh when we go out there, fiddler crabs. Fiddler crabs are very cute.
Why do they have that one?
The males have these big, single,
Would they fight with that?
what is this called? This is a
Mandible.
pincher claw that will that they use to attract females. The female is attracted to the male with the biggest claw, and so he waves it to her. When they come out, they'll come out of their little holes and they'll wave their claws, and the females look around and see the one with the biggest claw and figure, well, if he can survive carrying around that big old claw, he's probably pretty good. The males will also use them to fight over females and compete. And they usually don't actually fight. They just kind of bluff one another. It's kind of like guys bowing up with their chests. They bow up with their claw there.
Do it.
And the one with the smaller claw will usually back down. They can also lose their claws and grow them back.
Bigger?
That must
Yeah,
hurt.
well, grow them back eventually to probably the same size. But if you were to reach down and grab one by its claw, it will probably just fall off and leave you holding the claw. Because that's a survival adaptation where they can just lose their claws. And then they're not going to be able to mate for a long time until they grow that claw back, if they survive that long. It's tough life in the marsh. A lot of different birds and things will eat these things, so they have holes that they can run in if the bird is coming. This is the purple squareback crab. Have you ever seen any of those?
Yeah.
They run around in the marshes too.
Loki thought they were the same thing, and I always be like, why?
Yeah, they're different. You can tell by the two claws are the same size. And so we might see those when we go out there. You'll definitely see these. Look out for these. They're called periwinkle snails. And what they do is they crawl on the marsh grass and they eat algae that's growing on the marsh grass. They aren't eating the marsh grass itself, but algae grows on the marsh grass and they'll eat that algae. And then there's a lot of different organisms, birds and fish and things that eat these things. So that's part of the food
Like a
chain there.
symbiotic relationship.
It's
Kill me.
symbiotic is when you live together. I guess you could say that they're
Do they just go up there and eat and
symbiotic.
then leave?
Yeah, they'll eat and leave and crawl on the bud too, so they aren't like stuck together. But they do crawl up the grass every time the tide comes in to avoid getting drowned. So you will see them up on the grass, depending on when we go over there. You'll see some. You can eat these things. There are people who catch them and somehow cook them up.
Yum.
Mussels. If you dig down into the mud inside the marsh grass, you might see mussels. Have y'all ever eaten mussels?
Mm-hmm.
They're I tell you what, 10 points. If you and your partner can tell me, what phylum do mussels belong to? What big group do mussels belong to?
Yeah.
We already learned this. Just see if you know.
Oh, wait. You don't know, do you?
What group of organism are mussels?
Teamwork right there.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, put it.
I don't know. I'm gonna put that.
Think about what it has.
I got you.
Muscular area.
Muscle area.
Tony, you're a winner no matter what.
Okay, I'll give it to green.
How do you spell it?
You're a winner no matter what.
I'll give it to peach.
How do you spell it?
That's not it, but I'll give it to you. White sounds right.
You got it. I just spelled it wrong. Can I say it in your ear?
Blue correct.
Yeah, whisper in his ear.
Purple correct.
I really just held down to spell it.
Anyone else? Yeah. They're called mollusks.
You got it right.
Mollusks.
Yeah, I said it in my head.
Here's how you spell it.
What about bivalve?
I was so off.
Mollusks.
How'd you spell it?
Or you could have put bivalve. Bivalve.
M-O-L.
It's phylum Mollusca, class bivalve.
Mollusks?
Phylum Mollusca, class bivalve. Do you know another class for mollusks? Other than bivalve?
Shell Lyrian.
Gastropods.
Gastropods.
Those are like snails.
Nematodes.
And do you remember what octopus and squid are?
Cephalopods.
Yes, cephalopods.
That was green that said that.
You know everything?
Cephalopod.
George, you know everything. I like you.
So you'll find some of these in the marsh.
Some.
Here we're standing on the bank and you see these little bushes here? Those are, now we're in the transition zone.
That's what I was thinking.
Where you get all these little bushes that can survive flooding once or twice a month. Before I get into those different types, let's show you the video.
We're here at Folger's Marsh on the island of Nantucket. We're going to talk about what a salt marsh is. Salt marshes are communities of this grass and the animals associated with them that form in quiet embayments between the high tide and low tide marks. It's an interesting habitat because it's both an aquatic habitat flooded with salty water and a terrestrial habitat. When the tide comes in, as we see here at high tide, the water moves over the surface of the grass and it's partially an aquatic habitat. The grasses are experiencing salty water, which is not a great condition for them, but these grasses are adapted to tolerate it. And animals move on to the marsh and get some protection from predation. Things like a little shrimp and little fish can move onto the surface of the marsh. There's a gradation of species on the marsh from this edge or this low tide or low marsh mark to the high tide mark as you move back. At the edge, we have this species called Spartina alterniflora, or salt marsh cordgrass. It can grow pretty tall in some areas, and as you move back onto the marsh, it stunts. It's most covered by the tide for the longest period of time. Tides come in and out on a 6-hour cycle, twice a day. It can tolerate this being flooded by water because it has aerial roots. Plants take in oxygen through air, not through water. The animals that live on the marsh, however, most of them are aquatic animals, things like mussels and fiddler crabs, and they get oxygen from the water. I'm going to talk a little bit about the animals in the marsh. You can see there are birds feeding. This is an important habitat for feeding things like egrets and herons and osprey. The water that comes in through the marsh channels and flows throughout the marsh is important habitat for crabs and smaller juvenile fish of some commercially important species such as flounder and bluefish. We also have smaller species that are salt marsh creek inhabitants that provide food for the crabs and the other larger fish. At the edge of the marsh, there's a mussel that's attached to the substrate and to the roots of the Spartina alterniflora. This mussel, called the rib mussel, Buchensia delissus, has a mutualistic association with the grass. It provides nitrogen and stabilizes the roots, while the plant provides a place for it to attach to and a little bit of protection from predators. You also find fiddler crabs. Fiddler crabs make little burrows along the edge, and there's actually 3 species of fiddler crab that live in a marsh, in this marsh. Some live in this more sandy habitat, another species lives in more muddy habitat, and as you go back through the marsh towards the road, there's actually a source of fresh water, and you get a 3rd species that lives in that more brackish water, or less salty water. Fiddler crabs make burrows, and this burrow helps aerate the substrate. One condition of a marsh is that when it's flooded, you have a lot of microbial action going on and depletes the water that's in the sediment of oxygen. And so as you move back, if you were to dig a hole and let it fill with water, that water would be very smelly because of the microbial actions of sulfur. It also would have very little oxygen in it, if any oxygen at all. And this is also a physiological stress for plants and animals. So you can see a salt marsh is a very unique community of plants and animals that lives in this area of the coast. It's an important habitat. It's a habitat that provides a lot of primary production, which means the grasses take in carbon dioxide and turn that into organic carbon. It also is an important habitat for the coastline behind it. It provides protection from storm damage and a buffer zone between the sea and the land. And thirdly, it's an important habitat for these important commercial species and juvenile fish that use the salt marshes to grow larger. They use the food provided by the other smaller organisms that eat the detritus provided by the plants.
That was awesome.
You sound
Boston.
Just prepare yourself.
He's doing some good info.
That was pretty hard having sun around. Yeah. Sun was straight.
That's what it was.
No, but honestly.
You did a good job on that. It's not easy making videos. So what do you get on this transition community? Well, one of the plants that you see in the transition zone is needle rush. This is the marsh grass that's black. It's called black needle rush. It's black. It's real pointy. The ends are real pointy. And you think about the marsh grass, it actually hurts. If you were trying to walk through it, it would stick you. That's needle rush. And that's not located out in the middle of the marsh. That's located on the edges where the elevation is high, and it only gets flooded a couple times each month. And that stuff grows really good in that kind of combination. It likes mostly fresh water that it gets from rain, but it does like a little salt water a couple of times a month, probably to kill organisms that compete with it. So it's the only one that can survive in that area. There's another type of flower. It's called sea oxeye. And it's very prevalent. I don't think it's flowering right now, but you'll see like what happened where the old flower was with all the petals falling off. It'll have kind of a black round part, and none of the petals will be there. And then it'll have leaves that look like this. I'll show this to you tomorrow. It grows in huge amounts in the transition zone. It's called sea oxeye. They call it an oxeye because the flower looks like the eye of an ox to somebody.
It really doesn't.
I don't know. I've never really looked an ox into the eye.
I want to meet that guy over me.
But
I'm giving him peace of my mind.
sea oxeye. And then there's another plant called marsh elder that you sometimes see. It's got all these